What's up everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, I will cover changing the front brake pads in a 2002 to 2007 Saturn Vue. I will be changing the front right, so chalk the opposite wheel, which will be the rear left. Then, remove the plastic caps if you have them, and break loose the 5 lug nuts while it's still sitting on the ground. For me, it's a 19mm socket. Then, raise up the vehicle and support it with a jack stand. Never support it with just a floor jack. And finally, remove the lug nuts and remove the wheel. Now it's time to get to work. We will need to remove the 2 caliper pin bolts, one at the top of the caliper and one at the bottom of the caliper. For me, it's a 14mm socket. Break the 2 bolts loose, then remove them. And set them aside for later. Now the caliper is ready to remove. You may need a pry bar or a screwdriver to pry it out of place. And after it's removed, it needs to be supported so it's not hanging from the brake hose. I personally like to use a metal coat hanger. Route it through the caliper and suspend it from something up above. In this specific case, I'm hanging it from a suspension coil. The caliper is fully supported and there's no weight on the brake hose. Next, remove the existing brake pads. There's one on the outside and one on the inside, and they will slip out from the sides. And I set them down in the orientation that they were removed from the vehicle. When bringing in the new pads, we can match them up. This is the outside pad. And this is the inside pad. This one is unique because it has a wear sensor in the top corner. Make sure to match it up. You should also replace the brake pad clips to ensure that the pads slide freely. They may come with your brake pads, or you can purchase them separately in a brake pad hardware kit. Pop out the old clip. Clean up the surfaces using a wire brush if needed, and pop in the new clip. Push it in real good and make sure it's fully seated. And repeat the process for the top. They're both exactly the same, you can't mix them up. Remove the old one and pop in the new one. Next, remove the caliper guide bolt pin from the caliper bracket and grease it. Wipe off the existing grease and apply new silicone grease. If needed, you can replace the rubber boot or the pin if they are worn or damaged. And make sure the lip on the rubber boot seats over the shoulder on the caliper bracket to seal it, and the bolt needs to float freely. And repeat the process for the lower bolt. However, let's talk about the lower bolt for a moment, because there is something special on this vehicle. This is the top bolt, and this is the bottom bolt. Note that there is a shoulder at the end of the bottom bolt, and a rubber sleeve goes on that shoulder. Here's an example. However, in the past, for me personally, it has seized the pin and I had to hammer it out. Also, it's supposed to float. With the pin seized, the brakes will not function properly. I personally do not use the rubber sleeve and have not had any issues. I would recommend using the rubber sleeve because that's how it was designed, but if it's causing issues, removing it may be something to research and consider. Now it's time to install the new brake pads by sliding the ears into the brake pad clips. Make sure the pad is facing the rotor. Do not put them in backwards. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to get the ears in the slots. You may need to push on the clips a little bit to get the pads in. And here's a close-up of how the pads look when they're installed in the clips. Before installing the pads, it's often recommended to add grease on the ears where they contact the clip. I used to do this every time, but stopped a few years ago because it collects dirt and debris and gums things up. I did not apply it in this video. With that pointed out, everything is looking good, and we are ready to continue. With the new pads installed, we've added additional thickness to the pad and rotor stack up, and the caliper will no longer fit over it. The pistons need to be pushed back in to make room for the new pads. Place the old brake pad over the pistons, and use a C-clamp to press them back in. Now there's room to slip the caliper over the new, thicker brake pads. And when you push the pistons in, the brake fluid in the reservoir will rise, and technically, it's possible for it to overflow and you may need to siphon some out. I personally never experienced that extreme, but check the fluid level. Next, clean up the surfaces that will be in contact with the back of the brake pads, and apply a thin layer of grease to those surfaces. Then, unsuspend it, because it's time to reinstall it. Set the caliper back in position over the pads. You may need to push the guide pins in a little for it to drop down and sit all the way down. And reinstall the 2 caliper pin bolts to secure the caliper in place. And the caliper should float linearly on the pins. And tighten the bolts to 32 foot-pounds. Next, reinstall the wheel. Tighten the lug nuts in a star pattern to 100 foot-pounds and lower the vehicle. And don't forget to remove the wheel chocks. Then, before you drive anywhere, start the vehicle and press the brakes several times to push the pistons and the calipers back out to operating position. Otherwise, if you go driving around and press the brakes for the first time while driving, your foot will go to the floor and you will not stop when you press the brakes. Then take a little controlled test drive and make sure they work. Everything is all good here. So, that wraps this up. I hope you found it helpful. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.